Great. Welcome back. Hope you had a great break, spring break, after Easter, and school is starting today again. So, welcome to our seminar sessions on territory that my chair is organizing in collaboration with Milica Topalovic's chair and with the support of Sascha Delz and Hans Hortig. And very important is the person behind the camera, is Jörg Sowins, who is recording those lectures for our web pages. So today, what we would like to do, this is a poster that you have repeatedly seen with many titles and many layers. Today we would like to put the focus on architecture. Okay? So we are approaching it from a totally different vantage point. And so obviously the understanding of territory as architecture, the architecture of territory, then obviously urbanism as a practice that is a practice of architecture in its broadest sense. And then the term Anthropocene, which has been discussed in previous sessions, which foregrounds the notion that we are indeed understanding architecture in a much broader sense as a form of geo-architecture, to borrow a term by Le Corbusier, a form of geo-architecture at the scale of the globe. And then the term ecology, which is the red thread, with eco being the house that we collectively inhabit on this planet. And in order to place this focus, we decided to invite Harry Gugger, who is first and foremost an architect, okay, operating on several trajectories at his office, as Harry Gugger studio in Basel. You probably know some of his work, but also as a teacher at the EPFL, teaching design research studios, and also at his research laboratory, Laboratoire Bâle, at the EPFL as well. So an architect addressing the subject matter of our seminar from various vantage points. But first, I would like to briefly recap what we've done in the previous sessions. So the first session was by geographer Jason Moore, who talked about an ecology of hope, which quite surprised us, because when you read his text, you see how depressing they sometimes are. And what he did is he tried to position this ecology of hope as a result of geohistorical crises. And he traced them throughout the history of mankind, with the most recent geohistorical crisis being the Anthropocene, or climate change, which he reframed as the Capitalocene. So this was the first session. The second session was by Sascha Rösler 2 weeks ago, in which, from an epistemological point of view, i.e. from the history of ideas, he tried to frame what he called the ecology of urban climate, driven by the desire of mankind to control the climate of buildings, of cities, if not of entire regions. And today, we would like, with Harry Gugger, if you look at his title, he is going to foreground the term ecos from the Greek oikos, meaning house, dwelling, settlement or home, and revisit the term economy and the term ecology with a big question mark at the very end. So from the economy to the ecology and back again, question mark. This is a subject matter of a book that is, I think, volume number 10, could be volume number 11 in a series, and he sent us this book a few weeks ago, which both Melissa and I have read. Extremely interesting propositions are made, and we particularly liked also the subtitle, to think of analyzing territory through the lens of environmental objects. And when you talk of environmental objects, the first that comes to mind is obviously architecture, and this is reinforced by this photograph of a beautiful swimming pool complex in Portugal. But extremely important to this book is a fascinating essay that you've all received via email, hoping that you might have a chance to read it. If not, you might be enticed to read it after the debate. Homemaking on a Hostile Planet, co-written with Barbara Costa, who is also a team member at the LABA laboratory in Basel, and she will act as one of our respondents today. The second respondent, opla, I went too fast, is by Irina Davidovici, who is a colleague of ours at the ETH, working together with Thomas Vermaete at the chair of, how is it called, History and Theory of Urban Design. And she recently published a book on architecture, a series of interviews trying to address the culture of architecture, but also addressing architecture as a form, as an environment-making practice. And this is the second edition of the book that I highly recommend, Forms of Practice. So you are the second respondent today. So as usual, Harry will first give a presentation followed by a discussion, a collective discussion. So with this, please welcome Harry Gugger, from economy to ecology and back again, question mark.
Very good. Thank you very much, Marc. Milica, thank you very much for the invitation, and also your colleagues, of course, who are organizing this, and thanks to Irina for exposing herself with me tonight, and Barbara, of course, my collaborator. Actually, I just observe we haven't, what is proper doing here? How long is this to take, this input? We never discussed it. No, we never discussed it.
Let's say half an hour to 45 minutes.
Okay, I'll rush, and then I hope I'll make it. Ecology. No, it's not the wrong slide. No, it's not the wrong slide. Actually, I have not mistaken the topic. I'm someone who's taking this very serious. If there is a topic like ecology, I'm talking about ecology, even if I don't have to say too much about it. But I think one should be curious why a term like ecology even exists. If a term like economy is in existence much, much longer, actually almost 2,000 years earlier, coined by people like Aristotle. So why is it that we have two things referring to the oikos, to the house? Oikos here, the dwelling, and the nomos, the management. So why is it that a term like ecology finds its way into our lives? You should know that the economy we see and understand today is something very, very different from the idea of the original economy. The economy originally was really the household, the management of the household, and that's where the household action took place, the labor took place. And Hannah Arendt makes a very nice observation about these two worlds, the oikos being the place of coercion, labor, the private, and the polis, the place of freedom, action, and the public. And I think this is very important to understand that economy in its origins meant something very different than how we understand it today. And this has a lot to do with the Homo innovatus. You know how brilliant we all are, and how our brilliance actually, of course, is reflected in the immensely growing world population. You see a few of the advance, and of course, here it becomes somehow dramatic, no? Around 1800, if you look at this and remember this kink here, it's certainly interesting to observe that it's also then when the term ecology was coined. I'll come back to that. And of course, these curves, which we all know so well, the great acceleration, is actually a reflection on all these innovations we have made. And it's no wonder that these curves go in parallel, be it for whatever telephones. I don't need to go into that, ozone depletion and all that. And it all somehow starts in the 19th century. You have been visited by Jason Moore. I very much like his work, and actually I think he's very right to question whether what we normally associate with the Anthropocene and the Great Acceleration, whether this should be associated in that way, or whether it is not much more important to associate it with a term like the Capitalocene. Because I truly believe that the evolution of the economy into a market-driven global economy, this is really what made the Great Acceleration happening. It's the industrialization, it's the taking off of all these innovations, and of course the capitalist system, which somehow led to the world we are living in today. Now, to come to this term, which is the key term for our lecture tonight, the oikos and the loggia. And this was coined by Ernst Haeckel. He was a Darwinist, a very critical figure, German, and he coined that term, oikologia, in his book, Generelle Morphologie der Organismen, in 1866. So the relationship now of the living things to their environments. And this is important, as he was a biologist, but he was also a philosopher. He included the humans into this term, so this relationship of living things to their environments. And it's, as I say, interesting, and maybe it's a coincidence, because he was more informed by Darwinism, but maybe it's a coincidence, but I don't think so, that this term was coined when industrialization really started to take off. And you have in your poster, which I also find interesting, because initially this is a term, this ecologia, this ecology, is a very neutral term, is actually describing a science, a form of science. And how come that we nowadays have tons of ecologies, which allows you to write, I'm just reading from your poster, focusing on how the epoch of the Anthropocene reframes our conceptions of the urban and shapes new ecologies. The seminar's objective is to unravel contemporary forces at work in the formation of the built and natural environment. So, shapes new ecologies. So there is many ecologies nowadays, and how we use the term is, of course, ethically positive connotated in general, is something good, we believe. But of course, there is all kinds of ecologies, and basically, in a way, you can say that ecology describes very much socio-economical systems to some degree. But we have two major distinctions to make, and I would call them the Arcadian ecology vis-à-vis the Imperial ecology. The Imperial ecology, which is a biblical, I would call it, ecology, where the planet is made for us, for man. You know, nature, animals, they are all here to serve us. And this is this exploiting, mining ecology. I call it the Imperial ecology, where we start from the assumption that we have endless resources available, and if they get extinct, we will find new ones, or right now also fly to the Mars to make sure we have these resources available. And that's, of course, a linear graph with the capitalist system, which is based on growth. And vis-à-vis that, you have the Arcadian ecology, where sort of nature and humans and the living species, they kind of live in a balance, and this could be compared to environmentalism vis-à-vis the utilitarianism of the Imperial ecology. Now, I have to make a little frame about our research orientation at the Laboratoire Bâle, which we call urban nature. We are very much interested in the evolution of the urban, its form, and it's of course a play of words. We mean by that this opposition of urban and nature, this seemingly opposition, I should say, but also of course nature as the character of the urban and how this has evolved. And starting from this image is an important one for us, sort of the paradise vis-à-vis the open, wide field of the wilderness. This is kind of an idea of this opposition of urban and nature, or the city and the wilderness, which still somehow prevails in these depictions of the ideal city, where the architecture kind of acts as a frame of the nature as a backdrop. So you could say it's an objectification of the nature kind of framed by our intervention, the built environment. But you also see at the same time, you see they are pretty much from the same time. Dürer has kind of an already more subtle approach, I believe, where the intervention, infrastructure, and nature kind of are more in tune, and there is a fascination for nature and also an interest and a daring of going into it and exposing yourself to the nature. And we can go on 100, not even, no more, a little bit more than 100 years later. There's a total blur in this picture from Turner, Rain, Steam and Speed, where if you look at it, it's quite a small painting. If you go through the Turner Gallery in Tate, London, Tate Britain in London, at first sight you think it's a picture of nature, depicting nature, the mist. And then if you look carefully, you start to discover infrastructure, the steam engine here. But these two things become one and the same. And we were very happy to discover this image from Edward Burtynsky, who we like, that he allows us to use those images of the Yellow River Dam, where also here you have the traces of the dam and this idea of mist, this total blur of nature and infrastructure and the man-made built environment. You could also use this Cedric Price sketch, which is very nice, which talks about the blur He talks of the ancient city as a boiled egg, the fried egg. Again, you must know this, this famous sketch. And then the modern city, the scrambled egg, which, of course, in this aerial view of Chris Hatfield, shows on the case of Brussels how totally interwoven the urban, the city, and nature become, and actually these are becoming kind of pockets, pocket parks in the all prevailing urban system. And then these manufactured landscapes, again, images from Burtynsky, where it's not so clear. Is something like this still nature, or is this kind of infrastructure, or is maybe this nature? Because if you look at the idea of nature as being something uncontrollable, chaotic, maybe this is less controllable than this, where maybe this is could be coined more, or is closer to the idea of nature in that sense than this, which is really a well-maintained environment looked after by our farmers in the Swiss Alps. So what is culture and what is nature is put in question. And therefore, we believe that these dichotomies which we still operate are totally unproductive. And that we really have to question them and go beyond them, and in a very naive way, just go out there and look at our planet and understand all the diverse forms of urbanization which have been taken place. And they don't manifest in the built environment, they manifest in many different ways. So on that background, we always do, I'm now going into our latest study cycle. We have been working on a study cycle called Industrial Earth, where we have been looking at different phenomena of industrialization. And now this cycle, which we are working on our second year here with FACE, we call them environmental objects, this cycle. We have been working on Portugal, on the territorial scale. Then we work now on the city scale at this moment, and we move to the hinterland when next year we work on the manor system, the manor house system in the southwest of England. And I will give you a glimpse, it's really a teaser of what we do. Largely speaking, we are interested in understanding geographies, or you could say environments, as this term is here, or a milieu, how that informs forms of settlement, socioeconomical systems, how they are informed by the different geographies. And of course, as Marc said, we are also interested in translating this, how this translates, these geographies, how this translates not just in settlements, but as a matter of fact, of course, in architectures. And we have seen this image, Caesar's bath, but also the lightning field can be seen as a very good reference for this, or the Villa Malaparte, the spiral jetty here. This was at the Expo in Switzerland. And then, of course, one project I was working on, where kind of, depending on the weather condition, something which is not visible gets revealed and kind of makes a blur between something which is always shiny and then the concrete wall, which all of a sudden gets a similar quality like the carbon wall there. What is the method we apply? We work with cartography. For the territorial scale, we have a studio, and next to this, what is called at our school at the EPFL, an unité d'enseignement. It's kind of also half practical, half theoretical work, half a day a week, where we teach our more specifically Barbara, teaches our students cartography as a way of reading. And of course, the first act of also designing. It's stupid to think that there is something like a true cartography. It's always what you see and what you depict and how you put it on paper is already a first form of interpretation. Then very consciously, we don't go into the field at the outset. We work for a whole year, I should say. Maybe this is important. We work for a whole year. We work on the territory in the first semester, and then we go for a full 2 weeks in the semester break. We take our students into the field, and for this, there's a little mistake here, astrology. We could refer this to Lucius Burckhardt, to really experiment the field yourself and kind of understand what you have studied from afar in an immediate confrontation with the milieu. And then in the second semester, we focus on architecture. You could coin that as the phenomenology, where students kind of produce their projects kind of as a proof of concept, reflecting the territorial proposals we make in their architecture. Now for Portugal. That's such a typical mapping. That's the aerial view we are having already here. This is the focus of this area. And you can see here already kind of 4 landscape systems: the interior mountain area, the littoral, and then here the Montado region, and finally the Algarve. And in a way you have in Portugal, you could describe this as a double divide, a north-south divide on the one hand here, but also an east-west divide, an interior littoral divide. Like many of such countries, of course, there is a littoralization taking place, a very strong urbanization, where the rural areas kind of get neglected over time. But still, there is quite a substantial difference to be discovered. And you can see that here. This is an image depicting the area of the interior mountains. And you could say that there agriculture takes place in a rather small scale, like in a minifundo scale, whilst in the Montado region, this is latifundo, these are very large farms which somehow structure the territory in a very different field. This is a picture from Lisbon depicting the littoralization, and then of course the Algarve, which has become one of the major tourist resorts and is totally dominated by the tourist industry. Interesting is that this variation was of big concern for the Salazar regime in their idea of nation building. They were kind of troubled by this enormous, I have hardly ever seen such a diversity in geographies, landscapes, like in Portugal. Maybe Israel is another place I know. And they were, in their nation building, trying to define the Portuguese house. And it's interesting to know that the Portuguese architects, which we know, they kind of, in a subversive manner, took that project from the Salazar regime and made this very nice work, Arquitectura Popular in Portugal. They divided the country. They went out there to study the vernacular architecture, and these are ways of studying it. They have taken these pictures, but also they have then drawn the houses. to really understand the different kinds of architecture. And of course, what they discovered is a big diversity of architecture, which kind of is in tune with these different geographies. And I think you can only understand the sensitivities displayed in this kind of architecture if you know that these people were part of this project. So the birth of the critical regionalism is actually closely tied to this project of nation building and understanding the Portuguese house, but actually not discovering this one type, but the many types. If we now move to our actual project, dwelling on phase, where we work on the city scale. Morocco, of course, why do we go there? How do we kind of meander through the planet or on the planet? There is very clear similarities, like the literalization, which you can find. It's exactly the same, that the people from the rural areas move to the port cities, to the harbor cities. That's where the big growth is happening. But then in turn, of course, the Berbers from the Atlas region are also populating places like Fez. And we were interested in these similarities, but also interested, of course, in understanding another type of urbanism, the Islamic town, in form of the city of Fez, mainly it's Medina. This is one of our maps now on the city scale. What can you see here? This is the Medina, which is known as the largest pedestrian area on the planet. And what is very interesting, it's still considered to be an industrial space, so it's not just a habitat, but it's a place where serious production still takes place. Then in opposition to that, this goes back to the French, they didn't call it colonialization, they called it the French Protectorate. When after the First World War, they moved to Morocco, they had the policy not to interfere, also because I think they didn't understand how to handle this kind of a city. They always built a ville nouvelle apart from the old Medina. So this is the ville nouvelle in a houseman type approach. This was Henri Proust, who was one man in charge for all this ville nouvelle all over Casablanca, Rabat, Fez. And then you see the new outskirts, partly informal cities, partly formal cities, which grow in the plain. What of course is also interesting, I made this comparison, this is the same scale. This is the Medina, where still today 100,000 people live. I'm not sure how many people we would find here, but of course it makes you understand this very different kind of an urbanism, which is actually a market-driven urbanism, which is actually even a counter, you could call it a counter form to the antique city, the Roman city with the forum, with the polis, which is by which the polis is celebrated, whilst here the total neglection to a certain degree of public space. Just because you are here and I look at you, Japan has similarities in that sense. That the old, even in Tokyo nowadays, you find areas where squares, public streets like we know them, are hardly found. Why would they be here? Why would they go there? It's all explained by this convergence of three rivers. And it is a very nice topography, which allowed them to control the water, to have a very good irrigation system at the same time, serving the city with water, and having to build very little walls to secure Medina by the topography. And actually, it's a descendant of Muhammad who had to flee because of their conflicts and he was sending out his people and asking them to find a city which is an ideal dwelling, and there was water. There is quarries nearby, and back here you have huge plains where you find what you need, agriculture, and of course the religious space, the evolution where water plays, and then the industrial space with the tanneries here, where all this goes hand in hand with a very simple and very convincing system. And what, of course, is also interesting to see how the focus of this urban fabric is on the house, the individual house, always oriented towards the courtyard. The total internalization architecture actually exists in the inside and hardly on the outside. You are always overwhelmed if you go to these buildings because they are not bespoke here, and then all of a sudden they display this incredible richness. But also down to, we can assume that this was the bakery, which at the same time was heating the hammam next door, so that the public bath and sort of the feeding kind of were integrated in this neighborhood. I make a little excursion here. We all know about that, which is kind of strange because these are very questionable examples. You know about Team 10, Siam. Morocco played a huge role in this movement. This was the idea of the interpretation of such architecture. You could call it the Moroccan house, but then of course also extreme cases where I would call this the objectification of the Moroccan house with an incredible formal will by Candilis. He was working for Corbusier. He had a big name already, so he could claim that plot for himself and coming up with kind of the vertical Moroccan city. We know what came out of it. It was highly problematic and did not meet the needs of the local people. Whilst Albert Laprade, Prion, and Cadet, very little known, have this wonderful project. Right at the beginning, it started with the French Protectorate. Also still under is very interesting. They were working under Henri Proust, but he was a very interesting character. There is a book called Croquis, a wonderful book where he investigates Portuguese, Spanish, and Moroccan architecture. And if you look at this, you understand immediately how they have been able to build that. So this is new built. This was for the factories, the entrepreneurs which would come to Casablanca. They needed to house their workers. And it's basically the same families who moved there at the time are still, their descendants are still living there. And you can't believe, if ever you have the opportunity to go and visit Habus, it's one of the most delicate pieces of architecture with a very profound understanding of the elements of the Moroccan, the Islamic architecture, but also the climate. Now I'm coming to the latest, an outlook in a way to next year's work when we work on the manor, dwelling on the manor. Here we are interested if there is something like planetary urbanization. We of course have to talk about planetary de-ruralization, and maybe England being always a bit ahead of others. I claim, or we claim, that actually there is a counter movement happening in England where, because of their idea of, that they really were the early ones to work with the compact city, the green belt, and which has led to a collapse. London is the clearest example where actually I know people commuting every day from the southwest of England to London, because the pressure, the real estate pressure is so high, where all of a sudden these rural structures get reused by urbanites working in the cities. So we are focusing on the southwest. Why? Because this is still the most rural. You can see it from this aerial view area in England, where the settlement patterns have hardly changed. You still have the small villages, the market towns, and of course these structures are directly originating from the manor system, which is very nicely depicted here. A typical manor with the manor house, then the demesne, the best plots, the most fruitful plots owned, of course, by the Lord Manor directly, but then you have free fields, you have common pastures, so a very common idea with the village being here. And, of course, a total absurd pattern, in a way, of working in the field. And this has been changed, again, in the industrialization, and again, influenced by capitalism, by our system, where something like this has been turned into what we nowadays know, straight lines, where regardless of topography, where all of a sudden before a farmer, was one farmer owning these different plots, living here, but cultivating these different plots, finds himself now with his larger property, which of course is so nicely depicted, and we know this landscape, how this is defined by these property lines, and where the right to roam is put in question. I'm coming to an end, and citing the Club of Rome. Every state has been so used to classifying its neighbors as friends or foe that the sudden absence of traditional adversaries has left governments and public opinion with a great void to fill. New enemies have to be identified. And then they move on. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. And this brings me, of course, back to the ecology, how we tend to understand it as I said, as a very positive, ethically positive coined term. And I think we should be rather critical from greenwashing our ideas. And whilst I understand that we as architects tend to how do I put that now? Rather address ecology than economy, I think this is a pretty lost battle because, and this is a very nice example, of course, where the industry behind is still the very same, and the capitalist system working behind is still the very same. And I don't think we can tackle our problems and in that sense become ecological, if you would like to say so, by not addressing economy. I think we should make economy one of our topics. And the market, the global market economy we know of today, and we know of economies of scale, you cannot beat that system without addressing it in a political way. There has to be a political will. The economy by itself will not reframe its course, the course it goes, but we will have to become politically active, and I think we should not retreat on ecology, but also address economy again. Thank you very much.
Harry, thank you very much for this presentation and for elaborating what you're really doing at our sister school in Lausanne, and very much interested also in your final statements about the economy and the ecology. But one thing you didn't say, on the Club of Rome quote from 1991, are you saying they were wrong to brand, what do they say, the pollution, the threat of global warming, that being the enemy? Or were you suggesting that the enemy, as a matter of fact, is the economic system that might have created water shortage, famine, etc.?
Well, I think they were not wrong. These are certainly good values, objectives we all would like to pursue, but actually they don't address the true enemy, which is the economical system. And if the we now can go on with only eating bio food, what do I know? Yes, there might be a certain improvement, but if we don't tackle the economical system at its root and question that, I don't think we will, the speed of action is not there.
It's quite surprising because the Club of Rome, when it was founded, was very much about the economy. And so what is happening here in statements like that suddenly they shift to the effect rather than to the cause. Mm-hmm. But let's see, Irina, what do you think? Microphone, sorry, here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Harry, for a very expansive framework for discussion. I started thinking about a recent article by Georges Monbiot in The Guardian, in which he was talking exactly about this, the need to actually face capitalism as the main problem. Not the various forms of what capitalism could be, but just agreeing that a system that thrives on unlimited expansion cannot survive in the context of limited resources. So I take it that this is pretty much the argument that you're reinforcing from an urbanistic perspective.
Well, this and also this goes with the accumulation of wealth, no? Or the accumulation of the productive elements. And I think there has to be, on the one hand, a redistribution. And we cannot, unless you believe in going to the Mars, I'm rather invested on this planet and take care of what we have than trying to go to the... But we are all tempted by these heroic stories, as you can read in our introduction, no? That there is a heroic action is better for the media than just to take care of your back garden. You can't become a hero in your back garden, and so I think it's very important. If you don't believe in the Mars, as I don't. And anyway, for me, the vector is then totally unchanged. You are still on the path of exploiting, and you are still believing in some form of growth which you make possible through this or that action. And I think that this. I have a problem in the marble picture, sort of this planet and its uniqueness. I still believe it's a very unique system. And that's what this is our household, and this is where our attention has to be addressed to.
2 points. One is that, of course, those of us who grew up during the Cold War and while the Iron Curtain was still standing would see communism as an alternative to capitalism, and I just want to point out that they're pretty much about the same thing when it comes to setting production and infinite production as the ultimate aim. So communism is not a solution, but at the same time, says she who grew up in a communist regime, but at the same time, I was very interested, and I completely did not expect the manner. I was still back at Portugal. I was back a few years at your teaching program because I'm still basing my experience on your publications. But the manor system has this intriguing figure of the commons. Mm-hmm. And of course, the literature on the commons has skyrocketed in the last few years. There's a lot of research on it. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if communism and capitalism are, from an economic point of view, both exploitative. Do you think that this version of commoning has some kind of potential, and in what format?
Well, that's exactly why we are investigating this. I don't want to, far from romanticizing the manor system. I mean, this was a very hierarchical. There were all slaves. You know, it's a very hierarchical system. But can we maybe rethink that, reframe that? I mean, how does it really make sense that all these people kind of use this just as a habitat and commute to London, or can we make this again productive? And that's the idea behind, you know. Can you make this a true common system amongst equals by somehow having this workforce not investing themselves in London, but actually back in the rural areas? And it's very interesting. I go there for personal reasons for several years now, and there is, if you look at the data of population, there is no depopulation of these areas, exactly because of lots of people having to move there in order to afford their living. And little towns, Marc, like Tiverton, these are not depressing places. They have become more vibrant places, and but I think it's still something is wrong in the system if these people kind of have to commute 2 hours or more. And how can this be turned back into? Because I mean, these manors, they employed maybe 50, 100 times more people than the same size of a manor or a farm would employ today. And
But this current use of the manor is really, as you said, for commuters with jobs in the tertiary sector mostly. And it's the manors around London that benefit from this influx of professionals, young professionals who want to raise their children in the countryside and send them to decent schools. Mm-hmm. But of course, you also have territories that are further away, like in Wales, that are massively underprivileged. So it's very difficult to just escape the geographical and geopolitical framework. Mm-hmm.
Well, it is rather difficult to talk about a book that hasn't been written yet.
No.
So this is. But if you go back to the three case studies that you showed us, the first one focusing on territory, the second one focusing on a particular city, and the third one focusing on the hinterland, you could have done it all in Portugal. Okay? You didn't have to shift to Morocco. So let's assume that this was done in Portugal. Mm-hmm. What intrigued me in this book that you published is that architecture is running like a red thread. Okay? You're reading the territory as architecture. I mean, you began to read face as a form of architecture, down even to the courtyard houses, the positioning of the bakery that has obviously a connection also to the countryside, and then the subdivision of the land as beautifully depicted in one of the photographs by paintings by David Hockney. Mm-hmm. And this is for me what is unique about the work at Labar, is that you are architects. And what is interesting about your argument is that you're saying if we go back to economia as the management of the household, then architecture plays an extremely important role if we want to revisit the economy, rather than going to communism and to capitalism in its most vicious forms, to see the potential of architecture when it is connected to the management of the household, namely economia, in producing ecological systems. This is what intrigued me about it, because it revalues and repositions what we do as architects. So Barbara, since you were involved, what is your take on it?
So I think, so the text is playing with this idea of economy, ecology, and it's writing a thread about the opposition of the economy of travel and the economy of the home. Without going too much into detail, there's different meanings to the word of economy, which can mean the management of private affairs, and then you can also imagine the whole economy of the world as a whole management of private property, which would be more like a capitalistic interpretation. Or you can see it more as a kind of management of reproductive labor, as in an idea of maintenance, repair, of this kind of background condition of the more public sphere of the travel, which is the home. But I think this text was written a little bit, it's a tortured text, and it was a little bit of a research around this idea of this foreground-background relationship, which then comes back into the architecture, which is, I think, a running thread of the whole studio. So as an idea of this, ecology being a critique of the disembedding of economy in the web, from the web of life, where you have certain background conditions of the economic system, which are reproductive labor, nature, political systems, that are what allow for economical activities to take place. And so, and there's a hierarchy of power between them, right? Between the public sphere and the private sphere. So I think that the interesting part for me, at least, is this idea, the critique that ecology brings today is definitely a critique of economy. And it's and of course, this text is unofficially building up towards something that I'm personally very interested in, which is an ecofeminist approach to this, which is the one that looks at the ecological crisis from the point of view of the crisis of nature and the crisis of care. So this idea that, economy, there's two, that this economic model that we're living in right now, capitalism, is waging war on life. It's working against the material bases that sustain our bodily life, the possibility of life, and it's endangering also our forms of organized life, which is basically what architecture is supposed to think of. Not only architecture, but we can give a contribution.
So how would you answer the question mark at the end of the title? I mean, from economy to ecology and back, question mark. Yeah. Is there a possibility to go back? Yeah. Or is going back only a criticism? I mean, how can we retool the capitalist system?
Well, may I, Marc? Yeah. Marc, we have been... I don't need one, exactly, yes, sorry. We have had the pleasure to be in Cairo. And so I think that I would not know of a more pertinent example of where caretaking does not take place, where actually everybody seems to be totally threatened from retrofitting their existing cities. If something breaks, they walk away from it and build a new one, which is a half-cooked idea of an American city of the car city. Correct,
but this is those are the formal settlements that are the formal cities that are built in the desert. But if you go in the informal sector, you will realize that there are forms of care, there are forms of economia that and they form very strong social bonds within these communities.
But those are totally neglected.
Of course, they are marginalized, neglected, etc. But the communities within them are not neglecting them.
No, absolutely.
Sorry, and then.
Yeah, to be clear, I don't think economy and ecology are not necessarily against each other, right? Unless you mean capitalist economy, and then yes. Okay. I think we need to totally overcome it because, these two aspects of the idea that we cannot live independently from a material base of natural resources, which we have kind of exhausted since the 80s, and that we are currently living above not our individual needs, like is usually said during all of these kind of crisis lingo, but we are living above our territorial means. So, for example, just to give you an example, in order to maintain the lifestyle of a person living in Spain at the moment, you would need 3 planets. Somebody in the USA, you would need 5. Somebody in Kuwait, you would need 12. Therefore, it is quite obvious that in order to maintain these kinds of lifestyles that are above the limited means of the planet, the only way that you can do that is through fascism, right? It's through limiting, it's at the expense of other people. If certain parts of the globe, there's the issue of economic justice behind this, which is important. Capitalism will turn, and is turning right now, into fascism. When you hear people like Trump or the EU saying you cannot come into our country because there's no more space for you, they're telling the truth. Because at this material level of lifestyle, we cannot take more people in, right? So there is a problem of this disembedding of economic relations that see the economy just as profit-making in a way that is totally unrelated with our needs, right? Producing nuclear weapons is seen as equally important as producing food. So this disembedding...
How are you answering the question, Marc?
I have a microphone, yes.
So you can interrupt anybody.
Well,
Yes,
to put it clear, what Barbara is trying to tell you, maybe Donald Trump is more ecological aware than we all think. By putting America first, he clearly declares there is not enough for all of us. And I want to make sure that we have enough of the cake, So maybe he pretends to be not so aware, but actually he is super aware.
Okay, microphone. Either we're going to sing.
I just really want to move away from Trump. I wanted to go back to Laba, if I may, because there is this question that came up from looking at lessons from Portugal, and of course it follows a long series of lessons from different places. And your studio, your laboratory has a method, a sort of 3-point method. First, this extensive analysis, then the study trip, and then the architectural propositions. And perhaps you can also talk a little bit about the architectural propositions, this interface between architecture and territory. But my first question in relation to that was, how do you negotiate between the general method and the local specificity of cultural and geographic and economic, indeed, specificity of each location? Because as in your series, each of these locations throws up different questions. And I was wondering if your common point is this one, this interface between economy and ecology, or...
No, sorry. The common point is we are trying to single out. It's for a reason. It's called lessons. I think I understand an obligation to teach people here in Switzerland, in this culture, in this environment. And what we do, to put it very simple, we look for extreme cases. I take Athens. Athens was called City of Immigration. And of course, we have an immigration problem here in Europe, also here in Switzerland. But such an extreme case, even Germany does not live through such an... So there is something, we look for extreme cases and try to learn from that, and then understand what the lessons could be for our environment, for our culture. For example, in Fez, it's still an industrious, as I said, it's an industrious habitat, it's a place of production. And if such an impossible morphology where actually no car can drive through, it totally contradicts any idea of economy, as we know or believe to know. If that provides an economical basis, is there something to learn? Because this would make this maybe the most sustainable urban environment possible. I mean, on such a small area, 100,000 people living of it, that's quite extreme. And that's what we are interested in. And how do we make sure, just to finish, how do we make sure? I mean, we always engage with local universities. So that's very important that we have a partner university in each single case. Next year it will be Bath University. So that we, it's also interesting, this we do mainly also for the students, because if they have counterparts on their level, they learn an enormous amount from each other. And in an ideal case, we have had the best and the worst experience. It does not always work. Actually, it hardly ever works, but it has worked from time to time. Because there is such a clash of culture that there's simply only astonishment on both sides, but not actually a coming together.
Thanks. So thank you, Harry. I think it was really a great lecture and I really enjoyed it. And I also thank you for the book that we received. It's wonderful. I would like to ask a question about, I would say let's stay still in the teaching, but somehow I would like to ask you to reveal perhaps the ideas, your own learning, to say so, out of all these years of teaching. And I see that these notions have crystallized so prominently environmental objects and also the idea of architecture as environment-making practice. No? And I feel, of course, from the entire story that this is the I would say the kind of base of or this is your core message, and this is perhaps also the basis of some kind of a curriculum around which we could organize the education of architecture that we should be rethinking now in let's say, approaching the problematic of Capitalocene, the relationship between economy and ecology, etc. So I would like to ask you just to speak a little bit more about that. What are the core ideas? What are the differences from, for example, the architecture that you were trained in as a student? No? How do we have to change both the let's say, epistemology of architecture and eventually the practice of architecture? I'm just assuming that there will be political will, you know, to implement those ideas. I mean, that it, you know, just referring to the discussions that we had in the first 10 minutes of this conversation, right? So let's assume that there is a political will and that those ideas can find the ground. You know?
Well, very good question, thank you. In a way, I have to admit that maybe it was almost an accident that we moved into this direction. And this was when I was already engaged at the EPFL. Earlier, before I was, even before I was a guest, I was first a guest professor before I became an ordinary professor. I was involved as an expert because in Lausanne, unlike here in Zürich, they have this, by default, an individual diploma, a master thesis which they have to define themselves. And as an expert, I observed that they are totally out of depth. Because, I mean, let's face it, the normal education system in architecture, or at least how I experienced it, and I think it's still the prevailing form in a way, is really focus on architecture as an object. And also a pretty simple-minded studios where the professor looks for a site and somehow with his team defines a program, and often yeah, it's all there. It's almost like an architectural competition, and you never go beyond kind of the immediate architectural service. And this is, of course, I mean, and then you are confronting such educated students with the situation where they have to define their own thesis. This is really pretty problematic. And so my very first idea was to offer a method, an education, which forces them to define their own program, to define their own site, to really get beyond sort of, become, in a way, you could call it a developer, or play the role of a client. So go beyond, and ideally on both sides, go beyond just the designer role at the front end, but also at the back end. Our studio was called not Laba, but Lapa, which with a P instead of a B, which was for laboratory for the production of architecture. We always had, from the outset, we always worked on a full year. And we always had these territorials, but the focus was actually the production. We had bought, when I started, we had bought all kinds of equipment. It was into the manufacturing, sort of understanding how the design in a modern way, in a contemporary way, gets built and how you can still have an influence on the site. And it was following an audit at the EPFL where it was pointed out to us that we are really not well, our curriculum was not fit if it comes to urban and territorial studies. And the audit also said, funny enough, that we should not even try to establish this on our own, but we should try to establish this with another institution. So I immediately thought of the Studio Basel. And that's how we got engaged. And so I thought we should try, and it, again, only half worked actually, but to have this kind of 2 satellite studios working. And then the real focus was on the territory. But always, of course, I was always aware I'm not educating urbanists or geographers or whatever, sociologists. I'm educating architects. So the design or the understanding of all scales as potentially as an architectural project was key to our approach.
So I have a follow-up question. It's part of the same
Was this
question.
an answer? I'm not sure whether.
No. I think absolutely. So we understand the necessity to integrate the different scales. Now I'm wondering about what kind of practice conditions are needed in order to begin working, let's say, to have practice that responds to these issues, right? Because I think in educational context we have started, of course, Studio Basel, etc., territorial questions, ecological problematic, understanding of the kind of complexity of integration, all of that. So now, does, for example, practice in Switzerland, as you know it from your studio, respond or allow the thinking in that manner? And how can we also influence the practice or shape the practice or shape the institutions in a way that they give space to those approaches, let's say?
Well, there's an easy way. You create your own practice. I mean, not in the that you do little developments of single-family houses and then sell them, but that you try to somehow find your field of practice and out of an urgency and start to work in that. And if there is an urgency, you might get discovered. To change the institutions, that's the hard way, you know, and that's a battle. I would not even be able, because this is tactics. This is not. I don't have a strategy in that sense. This is really the daily battle you have with the institutions, and try to educate them beyond their ordinary briefs. And
but also
you don't make yourself very attractive to the industry by doing that. You have to be.
I mean, do you think that design position of architects has a capacity to integrate knowledge of various disciplines? Does this still hold?
Totally.
So that could be a very positive message for the students also.
No, of course. No, I mean...
open the field for questions. Charlotte was the first one.
Now it's that.
Yes. Thank you for the lecture and the very interesting conversation. I would like to pick up on what Barbara said about the crisis of care, which I think is basically addressing this, let's say, obvious point, which means a critic of ecology is a critic of economy. I mean, they are not to be separated from each other very clearly. And I want to bring this back on the field of architecture and architecture as a practice, because you already mentioned some paths that are there. I happen to be co-curating with Ciro, who's actually here, the Sao Paulo Biennale, and the topic is every day, and we use this to uncover questions related to maintenance as one of the axes. The others are related to resources, for instance. And what we have seen, we have started to receive now proposals for the exhibition, is a kind of a turn in the architecture profession towards what Kohlhaas has already called fundamentals, but a sense of urgency towards basic answers and perhaps more resilient solutions in terms of climate, in terms of materials. And this is for me what I could detect as being the way that the profession is actually taking into account this crisis of care, but of resource and global issues. And I was wondering if you, in your own way, I mean, you as a practitioner, you already talked about it, maybe there are also other directions, but if one could not understand this turn to a more basic and more resilient systems in architecture as an answer to these questions. So it's just a question to the panel, more as a general. Yeah.
So for me personally, and I think for a big part of the team, this idea of architecture as environmental objects is about embedding the architectural object in things around it, in contexts. That's why cartography plays a kind of strategic, it becomes a strategic tool in order to do this. And so the goal with this environmental objects, which we've been sort of starting to rethink as more like environmental apparatus or a collection of environmental devices, is really to deconstruct the idea of the autonomous form and the autonomous object, and to kind of go towards a sort of broken world thinking that is more linked to maintenance, care, and repair, values that are usually the opposite of, you know, innovation, creation, this kind of abstracted genius moment of the architect as a kind of autonomous author, right? Exactly. So we want to counter, this is what we see as a kind of escapism, and I think there's a link between this idea of the form and the idea, and this kind of Platonic notion of the public space and the male classical patriarchal figure that exists in a kind of abstract realm that has no link with things that are seen as being, you know, worldly and unimportant, like bodies, like, you know, everything that is about kind of, that is the things that create the condition of unfreedom, the reproduction of everyday life. So we want this to be a kind of more embodied, embedded, lowly sort of way of producing life. And so everything that is about, like, and there is a lot of this kind of talk, this churning around of the autonomous form of everything, which I think is, again, a kind of denial going like this about all the problems that are happening around us. And so for me, like, the whole, like, environmental object is about embedding the architecture into its material afterlives, into its modes of production, into its labor rules, into, yeah.
All right, microphone there.
Perhaps picking up on actually what, Barbara, you're just saying, if we are to bring this closer to a concrete program, and again to your initial theme of oikos as the dwelling, of course we haven't said the H word yet, the housing. And I was wondering how you, in your studio, or more generally, if you have a vision regarding housing strategies, especially because oikos, if I understand correctly, implies some kind of domestic scale of microeconomic, almost individual economy or individual family ecology. Whereas when we talk about housing, we talk about systems, we talk about standardizations, and this is where actually it impacts on a territorial scale. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how your students, but also how you envisage practice dealing with this.
I have a microphone, sorry, I'm so stupid. Yes, very interesting again. We were so stupid, actually, to force ourselves in the first year of this cycle on Portugal to not allow the students anymore the total freedom, but to actually ask them to focus on housing. And it was a disaster. Because actually, if I would have been smart enough, I would have discovered that actually we are contradicting our fundamental idea. And actually also, we are not only contradicting our fundamental methodological idea, but also our fundamental idea that housing, as you say, standardization, systematization, that leads to a form of housing which we have to go beyond, I believe, you know, and there's this typical now word hybrid, but actually we have to find forms where, as I say, labor, habitat come together in very, very diverse forms, or where infrastructures get inhabited. I truly believe, because if we would now really focus again on housing, it points immediately into some kind of a segregation, and this is, on an urbanistic level, I believe, really something to be fought against. And we also don't have the space anymore for this kind of segregation. If we truly believe, at least in our environments, in inner densification, you have to be much more inventive and really new forms of housing which somehow inhabit, yes, why not, infrastructure of some sort. And that's very important.
Other question from the audience? Yes? Do we have the microphone there? Who has the mic? Yeah.
Hi, thank you.
Close.
I switched it off, sorry.
Thank you very much for the lecture. I also would like to ask you a little bit more about architecture. As architects, how do you think, or what tools do you think we have to challenge or to change the policies that are obviously not taking care of environment, but are protecting more the big companies or the economy, let's say?
Well, I mean, the most obvious tools you have is space and material. And there's a lot to do just by considering space in an intelligent way and more important materials. So our very core... Huh?
You ended, your last word was, we have to become political.
Yes.
With space and material.
Well, through our very core discipline, you know. I mean, how generous are you acting with space? What kind of materials do you use? I think we are really that unconscious about materials still. We don't discuss this enough in our schools. The harm we do with the materials which we apply in our projects. And there is not enough of an impetus from us architects to revolutionize the materials industry. This is pretty clear, and that turns into a political act by default. So really focus on what you have at hand and do that in a very intelligent way. Just to maybe I'm not clear enough, if to point it out, our industry is responsible for more than 50%, for 40 and plus 50% of CO2 emissions.
And waste.
and all that. So, I mean, if we change our industry, that's already pretty much a good endeavor. Material will become very important because we can, if the vector goes how it goes, we can assume that the operation of our buildings will be sustainable. We can assume that. We will have sustainable energy sources. And if those become sustainable, all of a sudden the CO2, the carbon impact of materials, is the driving factor of CO2 emissions. And you know, with the digital world we have at hand, there are so many things to be discovered and innovated that I just say reactive structures which work with operational loads instead of always over-dimensioning our structures. We can even think of bringing the Bruce King said that bringing the carbon home. We can turn our industry, I believe, from an emitting to an absorbing industry. For example, if you use wood, not that wood is an answer to everything, or you can come up with new forms of concrete through really analyzing all the concretes which are produced on the world, and we can make concrete a more local material than what it is today. Not every concrete needs to be a Portland cement concrete.
Other questions?
Hello, thank you for the lecture. You partly asked a question, and that's why I was a bit hesitating, but you talk about sustainable energy, and I wanted to point out that in the EPFL, there is at the moment research on the fusion energy, so nuclear fusion, and this would be a way to produce almost infinite energy for millions of years because it uses water, salty water. And my question was, if then we could access this unlimited energy, then the cost of production would be totally changed, and then the society itself should find a new way to organize his system. And I wanted to know, you were talking about, yes, then we can develop new ways of materials and new ways of food. And I wanted to know if with this free energy, then the people and the societies could use it in a different way to manage the construction and every topic linked with consumption.
I guess this is too big a question for me, being simply an architect. No, but I think the point of your question is an interesting one, which we also, I believe, don't profit enough. We are, you here and we in Lausanne, we are educated at the Polytechnicum. We have these neighboring fields, which there is not enough engagement. I think we know a little bit, we architects, that we are working in an exhausted, on an exhausted science. It's a very old science we are working in. You know, we have at the EPFL next door, we have life science. The likelihood that you make a really groundbreaking discovery in that field is so much bigger than in our. I think we pretty much know what we need to know. And we now have to be smart in applying this knowledge. But we can learn from these neighboring fields. And having such an environment, there should be much more engagement. And too much I see that we architects we defend the autonomy of architecture. This is this big word, you know, and I can't hear it anymore. I think it's too simple-minded.
Last question.
Last question. Economy, ecology, this ping-pong game.
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about capitalism and renouncing it or going beyond it, ultimately, especially also your question brought up this, this issue, we talk about the curtailment of individual freedoms that we grew accustomed to and that we now take for granted. So, for example, when you talk about producing architecture that is resource aware, and in the context of housing, we can think of a certain brand of cooperative housing that embraces this ideal of the 2,000 watt society. I never know if it's 2,000 or 200.
2,000.
It is 2,000,
yes,
good.
Yes.
Quand même. But it is a very serious question that right now in the capitalist society, we are used to a certain access to resources that we take for granted. And it is now a voluntary system in which you, you engage yourself to curtail your activities in your own oikos, as it were, not have a car, not use this much hot water, and so on and so forth, in order to limit the consumption. I was wondering if there is some connection between this voluntary system and something that can be implemented at a wider scale. Wouldn't this not mean a top-down system? Wouldn't this be a political question?
No, I think I said. No, I think I said it's a political, there needs to be political will. I mean, there needs to be governance, there needs to be interference, there needs to be anti-course. This is very clear. I don't think, I was thinking when I listened to your speaking, I was thinking of the sharing industries. But, I mean, they seem to offer a way. At the same time, we discovered that they really can do enormous harm. So even with this very nice idea of a sharing industry, Uber or Airbnb, and the effect in Porto is depressing. And so it needs, at the same time, I think that's a way to go, but it needs political regulation. And otherwise it doesn't work. Or in the case of Uber, if then these people are only exploited, if they are not protected, it doesn't work on its own. It needs clearly governance.
It's not really a question. I read something that seemed like a great idea a couple of days ago that was about government in Scotland. Well, that's close to, I mean, let's say British, as you said, they are a little bit forward-looking, perhaps, and there are some interesting ideas. So they are actually relaunching overnight train, as a way to go from, let's say, London to Edinburgh or to other places. So as a very positive project, as a kind of enjoyable way to travel, as a way to experience landscape, etc., etc. So in a way, the hope is, of course, that our changing practices will be positive, right? That they will not be about denial. They will be about positively, going forward, let's say. So.
Great. If you're interested in those subject matters, we're going to jump into it next week with the launch of this book, which everything that we've discussed today is going to be brought up again, and Hans Frey is going to be one of the respondents, and we will promise you we'll make very short presentations, and then we have a discussion. Thank you very much, Harry. Thank you very, very much, Barbara and Irina, for joining us today. It was terrific to have you here at the ETH. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.